Hi, my name is Chris, and I just can't stop making things. Today I'm going to try and make a super cool drum out of an old propane tank I found under my deck. Safety disclaimer. Now, cutting into a propane tank is super dangerous. So basically I'm going to tell you right now, don't do it. Instead, you could grab a brand new propane tank at a store that's never been filled, or get one from a propane tank recycler and make sure they've emptied it out completely and that it's safe for cutting. And the reason for this is there's a couple of things that can go horribly wrong with a propane tank. First off, you have to make sure that your propane tank has no pressure left in it before you take the valve off. And with the newer propane tanks, even when you turn the valve on, if they're not connected to something, no gas is going to come out of there, so you won't know if it's empty or not. For sure. So first of all, you have to be 150% sure that the pressure has all been released before you take the tap off. And secondly, once the tap is off, you have to make sure any residual propane has exited the canister before you start cutting. Otherwise, if you introduce sparks into an atmosphere that has propane in it, kaboom. So basically, just don't do it unless you totally know what you're doing. Anyways, I'll show you how I cleaned out my propane tank to make it safe for cutting. Again, I am no expert on not killing yourself with propane tanks, so do your own research and don't believe anything I say. My tank had some gas left in it, and rather than just waste it off into the air, I hooked it up to my little portable barbecue and cooked up some ground beef to make tacos. Once I was absolutely positive that there was no gas left in the tank, I set up a high-tech system that was theoretically going to make it easier to get the nozzle off. However, sometimes theoretical ideas don't actually work in real life. Well, that didn't work. Maybe if I put it on the ground, it'll work better. Smart how I changed my shoes for safety. Also for better frustrated kicking. I don't know if I mentioned already how good of an idea it would be to get a tank that already has the nozzle removed. It might save you a lot of this kind of tomfoolery. Longer metal bar, something to jam into the hole, back end of a crazy pitchfork, and it finally starts to budge. Good job, made up tools. Out comes that thing. Now it's time to get rid of the last bit of propane that's still in the tank. So I started by turning it upside down and leaving it that way overnight. In the morning, I turned it right side up, squirted in some dish soap, and then filled it all the way to the top with water. The idea being that if it's full of water, there's no room left for the propane. I filled it up, watered some flowers, and then dumped the water out. I repeated the filling and dumping process at least 2 more times, just to make totally sure there was no propane left in that bottle. Alright, with my tank all cleaned out, I grabbed a wrench and started wiggling back and forth like crazy on the rim around the bottom. My goal, of course, being to break off the welds that are holding it in place. Also, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, I should be wearing gloves. Ah, there we go. Same idea for the top, just with a bigger lever. Bucket to hold the tank. Well, I grind it smooth where the top and bottom rings were welded on. Then I found a better sized bucket for holding the tank, turned my original bucket into a chair, and proceeded to sand off all the paint on the bottom and the top, and partway down the sides. I am of course wearing a mask so I don't breathe in any of that crazy dust. I then made marks where I was planning to cut off the top and the bottom. I used the floor and a block of wood as a guide, which would have worked if the tank was actually standing straight on the floor. It wasn't, so bad idea, Chris. The next thing I did was design a little template on my computer. The sizes I used for the notes on this template were mostly just educated guesses after looking at about 1 million different tank drum designs on the internet. I printed out my pattern, taped it all together, and cut out the... what do you call those things? Tongues, maybe? We'll call them tongues. Cut out the tongues. I taped the template onto the bottom of my propane tank and used a permanent marker to trace the tongues. The bottom straight line of those tongues doesn't get cut out, so I drew a little short line there just for reference. I hung my rotary tool on a nearby ladder and used a cutting disc to create a slot that I could start my jigsaw from. Because I don't know how long the tongues are going to need to be to get the notes I want, I try to keep my cut close to the curve of the tongue, then I'll lengthen the long straight lines of the cut later if I need to. Test the tuning of my first tongue cutout. It's a whole octave higher than I want the end result to be, but that's okay. I leave it there and continue cutting all the rest of the tongues in the same way. Once I have the cuts partway done on each of the tongues, I put a little blue tack on all the notes but one so I can isolate the sound. I grab a tuner and a mallet, and start slowly extending the cuts on the tongue. As the cut gets longer, the note gets lower. It doesn't take a lot of cutting to make a big difference, so I went really slowly, lengthening the tongues by a few millimeters at a time. For this first round of tuning, I tuned each note one whole note above where I wanted it to finally end up. I securely fastened the tank to a workbench and carefully cut right on the line I had drawn earlier. I want this cut to be as straight as possible because I'm going to have to put the two halves back together at the end, and I don't want any big crazy gaps. If you remember, the line for the bottom half I drew earlier wasn't straight, and at some point while I was cutting it out, I realized that. So for my second try, I measured from the center seam out, and that seemed to work a lot better. Handily, I happened to have a giant roll of wood edging that I could use to connect my dots to make a nice straight line to cut on. And so I did. Get rid of the razor sharp edges left by my cutting disc, make sure that it's still distracting enough to keep me from actually working. Check and check. I clamped a giant magnet to my workbench and tried numerous different sanding/grinding devices to see if I could get rid of all the rust on the inside. The one that seemed to work best was this one attached to a drill. I don't remember what it's called, but that's what it looks like. Repeat the process on the bottom half till it looks shiny, and then I used an old sanding disc as a circle template to cut a hole out of the bottom. To be honest, I don't know if that improved the sound of the drum or not, so it might be worth playing around with a bit. I wish I could hear two versions of the drum, one with the hole and one without, to see how they sound, but I can't, because I already cut it out. Also, that makes a sound. I transferred all the note names to the inside of the drum for reference later, and then proceeded to sand the outside till it looked nice and shiny. And because I just can't get enough sanding, I sanded around the cut marks in the tongues just to get rid of any sharp edges. I had read somewhere about heating steel to 500 or 600 degrees to relieve internal stresses, so I turned my oven to 500 degrees and chucked the two halves in. I cooked them for a couple hours and then left the oven to cool down before I took them out. What I didn't realize was you're supposed to cook them at 500 degrees Celsius, and I was cooking at 500 Fahrenheit. So though I may not have reduced any internal stresses in the steel, what I did get was a really cool patina on the drum. I'll still call that a win. Now it's time to glue the two halves together with some epoxy putty. I cut off a chunk, mixed it together super well, made it into a snake, and applied it along the edge of the bottom half of the drum. Now in reality, this was actually not very easy. The epoxy putty has a really sticky texture when mixed up, making it want to stick more to your hands than onto the drum edge. I also found that I just barely got it all in place before it started to harden, so I would have liked to have a little more time to work with it before it started to get hard to work with. I did manage to get the two halves together in time, squeezing them together and then smoothing the putty up against the crack from the inside as well. I used a utility knife to trim off any extra putty around the outside edge, and I left the putty on the inside edge as it was. With the putty cured, I superglued a strip of leather around the drum to cover up that mess of a seam. A nice clear coat to protect the beautiful patina. Then it's time to make a cup of tea and do a final tuning. The tuning's done the same way as before, a note at a time. But this time, instead of using my jigsaw to make the slots longer, I'm just going to be using a handheld hacksaw. Once again, I'm just cutting a tiny bit at a time between tunings, because once you go too low, it's pretty much impossible to get it back up. So lots of patience, lots of cutting, lots of tuning, lots of tea drinking, and eventually everything was pretty much in tune. Now the last thing I needed was more than one mallet. So I bought some of those felt things you put on the bottom of chairs to protect them from the floor. Actually, I guess it's to protect the floor from them. Unless of course you're super into keeping the bottom of your chair legs looking their best. Anyways, I stacked up my felt discs, drilled a hole through the center of them as best I could, threaded them onto the longest carriage bolt I could find, hammered the snot out of them to make them softer, added a nut to hold them in place, added some heat shrink to protect the drum from getting scratched by the threads of the bolt, and spread a little E6000 glue on the exposed parts of the bolt and the nut, again to protect the drum. Then I just left the drum sitting around to see who would play it. Apparently, pretty much everyone. Thanks for watching. See ya.